Hi, my name is Matt. I'm a current strategy and operations associate at Google, and prior to that was a management consultant at BCG. And today we're going to go through a Bain & Company case example that they actually have on their website. I have my laptop right here with the case pulled up right here. It's called Coffee Shop Co. And let's dive right into it. So the background of the client is that a friend comes to you for business advice. So you're having lunch with an old friend from university, and she's looking for some business advice. She is thinking of opening a coffee shop in Cambridge, England, a large university city an hour and a half away from London. Now she sees potential in this business, but wants your help in determining whether opening a coffee shop is a good idea. What do you think? So I want to walk you through essentially what goes through my mind when I receive a prompt like that. And so typically I have a piece of paper pulled up, and that's what's going to be happening with you when you're in an interview, because you're going to have a piece of paper and you're going to be ideally taking notes. And so we need to take notes on what the problem is. So the problem, from my understanding, just having read it, is friend is asking us for advice, right? And it's specifically, should he or she open the coffee shop in Cambridge, England? So should friend open a coffee shop in Cambridge, England? All right. So you should always write down the initial question or the initial problem that you're trying to solve, because what I've found is that it can be very easy to get lost in the details when you're doing a case and sometimes completely forget what the initial problem that you were even solving for was. And so if we just write it at the top of our paper or wherever, maybe in the corner, then we can always go back to it and reference it, and we won't run the risk of accidentally forgetting what the original question is and then having to re-ask the interviewer, which obviously isn't a very good look. What's up, guys? Just wanted to pop in here and let you know that I'm starting a community for people who are interested in consulting or strategy roles. If you're currently a student or maybe an early working professional who's thinking about making a transition soon, you'll find this community really helpful. I'll be in there every week hosting weekly group calls, and you'll be able to interact with a lot of other people in a similar position as you. If that sounds interesting, then make sure to check out the link in the description below, and I'll see you on the inside. And so what's going through my mind is when I reread this question, should my friend open a coffee shop in Cambridge, England, there's a bunch of questions that are going through my head, right? Specifically, if you think about like opening a coffee shop is one thing, but then like in Cambridge, England is another thing. And so there's like two components here where like component one is like things that you should consider when you're just opening a coffee shop in general. And then component two is like, what are the subcategories of things that we need to consider because we're in Cambridge, England specifically, which is its own city and distinct from other locations across the world. And so starting with this first part, I would want to think about, okay, what are the things that we need to think about when opening a coffee shop? Well, the first one we can think of is obviously location, but that's kind of covered. That'll be covered in the next set of questions related to Cambridge, England. But also you want to think about things like startup costs, what are going to be the operational needs, and needs could be things like obviously raw materials, right? The coffee beans, but it could also be like labor, for example, people that you would need to hire to run your coffee shop. And then, there's a number of other things we could brainstorm as well, but this is kind of how I start thinking about potential clarifying questions. I break down from the sentence, from the problem statement, what the main components are. And in this case, there's two, which is generally opening coffee shop. And then the second is in this specific location. And so then I start brainstorming different things that I think are important to consider related to each of these. So I've brainstormed a few related to just generally opening a coffee shop, but if we were to take this location bucket and really break it down even further, clarifying questions related to Cambridge, England would be like, what's the population of Cambridge, England? Or like, what kind of demographic resides in Cambridge, England, right? Because different cities are made up of different groups of people, and different groups of people have different behavioral characteristics. Some people drink a lot of coffee. Some people don't drink any coffee. Some people prefer to drink tea over coffee. So there's a lot of things related to the demographics. And demographics is similar to, I'll just say /customer, because the people that live there are ideally going to be the customers when it's a coffee shop. And so we need to understand who lives there and what the breakdown is. And I think that's the most important thing when it comes to thinking about a location, is like who lives there, especially if we're thinking about a coffee shop. But let's think about specific clarifying questions now that you could derive from this set of considerations that I've just off the top of my head come up with. And I want to caveat also that this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's probably other things that I'll think of after I've finished recording and uploading this video, but that's not the point of the video. The point of the video is to show you my thought process and how I go about it. And so let's just now go ahead and take what we have and brainstorm a few questions. So this first one here, which is like, what's the population / demographic, could be one question of like, and I'll just write clarifying questions here. So we'll write them all down here. So first question could be, how big is the population? And then a follow-up to that could be like, what is, or actually let's just say, who lives there? Okay, so that could be a clarifying question right there. And then going back up to these other considerations related to just opening a coffee shop in general, we can come up with a few other questions too, like, how much is it going to cost? What will it take to, let's just use the word operate, right? And so here are two very good clarifying questions to start with already. And see, we've taken this vague question of should your friend open a coffee shop in Cambridge, England, and we've already broken it down into 2, or I would say more like 4 questions that if we can get some kind of detail or some kind of an answer, it doesn't even have to be a super high level of detail, it'll already help us to understand a little bit better whether or not it's a good or a bad idea to open up a coffee shop. And so in an interview scenario, you basically want to present these questions to your interviewer after you've written them down. You want to say something like, awesome, so just to make sure I understood correctly, it sounds like the problem here is that our friend wants to open a coffee shop, or at least is considering opening a coffee shop in Cambridge, England, and they've come to us to ask us what the key considerations are and if they should open up that coffee shop. And so a couple of clarifying questions before we get into it. How big is the population? Would be curious to understand who actually lives in Cambridge, England, and what the demographic looks like. And also just curious about how much it'll cost for us to open up a new coffee shop. I would imagine there's some kind of upfront capital investment that needs to be made, because you don't just open up a coffee shop. You need to get the funds from either the bank, out of your own pocket, or you know somebody else who's funding this venture. And so it's important to understand how much it'll cost, and also related to that, how much is it going to take from a resource perspective to actually operate this coffee shop once we've gotten it up and running and once we have this business in place? Is it even going to be profitable? And so that's kind of the way you want to go about it. And in this situation, since I do have the answers here, but I'm going to walk you through how this would typically go, the interviewer basically has some responses to some of the clarifying questions that you have, and they might respond basically to the questions that you have with either specific answers or specific details related to each question, or they might just kind of answer in a deliberately vague way, which should indicate to you that maybe there isn't any follow-up data to that specific clarifying question, and maybe it's not as important to consider in this case. But anyway, once you've done that and you've had a bit of a back and forth with the interviewer about the clarifying questions, then it's time to go into developing the framework. And so this is something that sometimes intimidates people because they either don't understand what a framework is or they don't really know if their framework is good. And so to answer the first part of the question, a framework, very simply put, is just a set of buckets of different areas or topics that you think are most important to consider in order to develop a recommendation that you feel confident in. And so what makes a good versus a bad framework, though, that's highly subjective. But there are certain principles that apply that make certain frameworks better than others. And the most common principle that people are taught is the MISI principle, which simply stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Mutually exclusive, meaning that the components in your framework, the buckets, don't have any kind of overlap. So if it was a Venn diagram, it wouldn't have any overlap. And collectively is exhaustive, meaning that the topics, aka these buckets, are all of the buckets, or at least they encompass all of the potential problems or solutions available so that you don't accidentally overlook something, right? Because you could have a mutually exclusive framework, but if it doesn't encompass the entire universe of possibilities, then you might be missing out on something that's actually the solution. And so this is the principle that everyone is basically taught. If you looked at any kind of case interview
guides or you've read any books on how to do case interviews, you'll hear this term being thrown about all the time. Oh yeah, you need to be MECE. You need to make sure that your framework is perfectly MECE. Now, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that yes, it's good to be MECE generally, but it's okay if your framework is not 100% MECE. And before you go, Matt, what are you talking about? You have no idea what you're saying. I just want to point out that there are a lot of frameworks that aren't 100% MECE. And I won't get into the details in this video, but as long as your framework's like covering 90% of things, and specifically as long as it's covering the most important things to the case, then you're totally fine. So don't agonize too much over being MECE, but use it as like a general guiding principle. But anyways, now we have to come up with our framework. And so I'm gonna erase all of this, but I'm gonna leave our key question at the top so we can, again, remind ourselves of what we're trying to solve for. And so if we wanna be totally MECE though, an easy way to start is to do something that is opposite. So using the opposites principle. So for example, an easy one is financial factors versus non-financial factors, right? Because these are opposites, it's either gonna be a financial factor or it's gonna be a non-financial factor. You're MECE. Now, once you get past this first layer though, I'd argue you don't need to be as MECE, and it's okay if there's like some things that are in your buckets that aren't completely MECE, because at the end of the day, it's gonna be almost impossible to come up with a 100% MECE framework, especially under time constraints of having like a minute to come up with this framework in a case. So realistically, just try to make sure that the first layer of your framework is mostly MECE, and then the things that you put under it, so for example, I'm gonna put a bunch of examples here now, those don't necessarily need to be that MECE. I know, this might sound a little bit controversial, but I'm all about being practical here, and like 90% of people, when you only have a minute to do this, you're not gonna be able to like spend so much time and effort making everything perfect. And that's just not realistic. We wanna have an 80-20 mindset here. So, all right, let's think about some financial factors. So financial factors, first one I can think of is CapEx, capital expenditures, upfront investment that is needed to start up the business, whether it's like purchasing equipment or even like maybe buying the building that the coffee shop in is, even though realistically you'd probably just rent, but just giving some examples here. Actually, what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna break this into a revenue cost thing. So revenue and then cost drivers. And then costs would be fixed versus variable, and then revenue would be price, and then like volume factors. So now, surprisingly, this is still MECE, but anything that would influence price, volume, fixed versus variable costs, these are all going to fall into the financial bucket. And so let's just brainstorm a few here. So fixed costs would be things like CapEx, as I mentioned, the upfront investment that's needed, because that doesn't change with volume. Same with things like utilities, right? Because it doesn't matter how many customers or how many cups of coffee you sell, you're still gonna have to pay the same amount of electricity, or generally speaking, your utilities is gonna stay roughly around the same, regardless of how many customers are coming through your doors. And then let's brainstorm some variable costs. So this is pretty easy. This is like coffee / like any inputs, raw materials. And I would say wages or labor to pay your employees would probably fall under, I wanna say fixed, but it can be a little bit fuzzy, because if you wanna open your shop for more hours, then obviously the labor cost goes up, but it doesn't go up with how much volume of coffee you're selling. And so I'm gonna put it in this fixed cost bucket, but if somebody disagrees, feel free to call me out in the comments. You guys keep me honest. So anyways, with price, this is just like, what are we pricing it at, right? And then volume is going to be just how many cups are we actually selling. But now let's get to non-financial factors, and this is where I think it will get kind of interesting. So the first one I'm gonna put is customer. Now the reason I chose customer is because 99% of the time you wanna have some kind of a customer bucket in your framework, because customer is important to the business. You don't have a business if you don't have a customer. And so if you're not thinking about what the customer wants and who the customer even is, then you have no business running a business. And so on the customer side, we can think about, okay, what are their preferences? What do they even care about? What do they even want? And then segmentation of the customer base. Now I know segmentation sounds like a fancy word, but management consultants always use this word, and it simply means, what is the breakdown of the customer base? Of your entire customer population, the people that buy coffee from you, what percentage of those are male versus female? What percentage of those are age 50 plus or age 20 and below? What percentage of that population is a frequent coffee drinker versus a non-frequent coffee drinker versus a non-coffee drinker, if that's even possible for a coffee shop? Maybe you sell tea and so they buy tea from you. But just understanding how your customer base can be chopped up by various segments is going to be critically important for us to be successful. And so that's the customer bucket. Now, the next bucket I want to consider is competition. Actually, I'm going to name this bucket the market bucket. Now, the reason for this is because the market can be split into two things: size/growth, and then also competition. And under size/growth, this is simply understanding how big is the market for coffee from a coffee shop in Cambridge, England. And is that market growing or is it shrinking? If it's growing and it's massive, then that's amazing. But it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's not growing, because maybe there's very little competition, so there's still opportunity for us to take share and to grow our business. But this is why competition is important, because we need to understand who is the competition and what's the concentration of competitors. In other words, not just thinking about like physically, like are they concentrated as in like, is there a coffee shop on every corner like there is in New York City, but what is the market share concentration by competitors? So is there one guy like Starbucks who's taking up half the market and then the rest is like a bunch of random no-name dinky local coffee shops? I have nothing against local coffee shops, by the way. I love local coffee shops. But just giving an example, or is this market completely just fragmented and filled up with a bunch of small players and there's nobody who has over 20% market share? Understanding these things are going to be very important because it's going to influence whether or not we actually want to go ahead and open our own coffee shop. If there's only 2 or 3 massive competitors and they have like basically the whole market, then it might be very difficult for us to actually compete effectively and to enter as a new player. Now, there's a counter argument to that, which you could say like, oh, we can come in and be a disruptor, and we can, you know, if we have some unique value proposition and some unique product, then we can disrupt the market. We can disrupt the incumbents. Now that can be true if you're in tech or maybe healthcare, but not coffee. Coffee is a little bit tougher because there's limited differentiation in the product, but that's besides the point. So broadly speaking, let's go through the framework again. I've bucketed by financial factors versus non-financial factors. Under my financial factors, I've broken it into revenue and cost. Under my non-financial factors, I've broken it into customer and market. Now, there could be a few other things that I put in this non-financial bucket. For example, I could do something like risks. So this bucket is going to be basically encompassing things that could potentially go wrong. And so a couple things I can think of are executional risk, which is what if, even though we have the perfect plan, we fail to actually execute on that plan, which is a very real problem for businesses. Another thing could be macro risk. Like what if all of a sudden the price of coffee beans skyrockets and then it becomes impossibly expensive to sell coffee and then we go bankrupt? That is a real risk. And so that could be another thing. Now, we could brainstorm a few other risks here, but I want to just finalize this section and just show you that, okay, this framework right here, although it is not 100% MECE, it is MECE at the first level, and then it hits on the most important buckets at the next level. And that's what matters. You need to be able to have a conversation with your interviewer about, okay, customer, okay, market, okay, risks related to this. Because the next thing you need to do after you come up with this framework is you need to walk them through your thought process, and you need to say, awesome, so I've taken some time now to put together a framework, and I'd like to walk you through it. Broadly speaking, I've split the key considerations into 2 main buckets, the first being financial considerations, the second being non-financial considerations. And to walk you through each of these buckets now, in the first bucket, here I'm curious about factors that influence revenue and factors that influence cost. And in the non-financial bucket, what I think is most important is to consider who the customer is, what the market looks like, and what the key risks are related to actually starting and running this business. And then you can just go down the list. And so after you walk the interviewer through the framework, because this is a Bain case, that means that it's probably going to be interviewee-led, which means that it's on you to basically push the case forward. What you should do is you should suggest a bucket that you think is the most important to consider or where you'd just like to start. Okay? Don't overthink this part. Some people stress a lot over, oh, did I pick the right bucket? Just pick one that feels important to you and then just push it forward. So say something like, okay, so those are the buckets that, again, I'm thinking about considering. I'd like to start with the market bucket because I think it's really important to understand, first of all, the market in Cambridge, England, and who the customers are there, who the competitors are, and how big the market even is, right? And so based on what you say, the interviewer should react. And you have to be really perceptive to how they react, because if they react in a way where they're like, oh yeah, that's, makes total sense to me. We actually have some data related to that, then you know you're in the right direction. But if they say something a little bit more vague and they kind of sound like they're trying to dissuade you from going in that direction, then don't push and just realize that it's probably not a direction that the case is supposed to go in. And I know some of you might be thinking, what the heck? Like, these case interviews, they're supposed to test my problem-solving ability, but it seems like there's only one right solution. And in some ways, yes, it is a little bit frustrating sometimes when you think that one bucket is the most important to consider, but then you get pushed in another direction. But just go with it, okay? You need to be able to roll with the punches. And at the end of the day, you really only have like 30 minutes in an interview, and so there's not a ton of time to just debate what the most important consideration is. But anyways, in this case, just moving along here. So the case reads, you show your proposed framework to your friend, and she really likes it. She's especially interested in figuring out how big the market is to best estimate how much coffee she can sell. She knows the market probably includes commuters, visitors, etc., but for now, she wants you to focus on Cambridge residents alone. How do you estimate the size of the market? Amazing. So we've basically found ourselves entering into the next phase of the case, which is a market sizing question. And so maybe I'll just use the left side of the board here. So market sizing. The first thing you always want to do when you're working on a market sizing problem is you need to think about first what the question is, but then ways that you can clarify the question. So there will always be ways that you can clarify the question. The question in this case is, what is the market for coffee in Cambridge, England? And some of you might be thinking, wow, that's already pretty specific. What do you mean? Let me tell you. So there's a couple things that we could clarify here. The first is, what do you mean when it's the market? Is that like number of cups of coffee being sold, or is that dollar value? You need to always clarify that. Then second is, when we say for coffee, is this like coffee beans, or is it like cups of coffee that are sold in commercial cafes? Because somebody could go to Walmart and buy a bunch of coffee beans. And so we need to clarify, like, is this actual cups sold at cafes, or is it something else? And then even within Cambridge, England, you could clarify this and say, okay, is this like the actual city proper, or is it the entire surrounding metro area, right? Because if I think about, I live in New York. I don't know what it's like in Cambridge, England. Somebody correct me if wrong, but in New York, for example, a lot of people, when they think about New York City, they're referring to Manhattan, which is only one of the 5 boroughs. New York is actually much bigger than Manhattan. And so just clarifying that would dramatically influence the outcome of this sizing. And so we need to be very thoughtful about, okay, what can we actually clarify here? And that's how you want to be thinking about it. And so don't assume that anything is given. You always want to be questioning things. Okay, and so for market sizing questions, there's 2 approaches that we could take. One is we could do what's known as a top-down approach, which is when you basically start with a very big number, usually the population, and then you work your way up to that big number. Now, 9 times out of 10, I would recommend you go with top-down, not bottoms-up, because top-down is usually a little bit easier due to the fact, because in my experience, usually the interviewer will have some kind of like very big, juicy population number, or some number that you can then use to whittle down slowly to your actual market size. And so you can ask your interviewer, hey, do we have any information related to, say, the population of the city or any other data points related to the market? And they may or may not give you information that can indicate whether or not you should do a top-down or a bottom-up. But I would say 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a top-down. And so today, I'm going to walk you through how I would think through a top-down approach. Okay, so in this scenario, once you do ask the interviewer these clarifying questions, they are going to tell you that, yes, this is the city of Cambridge, England. You are actually solving for volume, so it's cups of coffee. And yes, it is cups that are sold at cafes. Okay, so the way I am thinking about this is we probably want to start with a tops-down approach. So we're going to start with a population number. And then we need to determine how many people actually drink coffee. So number of coffee drinkers. And then we need to get to like how many cups of coffee these people are actually drinking. And of those, how many of those cups that were drank at cafes, as opposed to being brewed at home, which wouldn't be a part of this market sizing exercise. And only once we do all of that will we get to units of coffee sold at cafes on an annual basis. And the interviewer is going to give you two pieces of information after you walk him through his approach. He's going to basically tell you that, look, we have a population number of 100,000 people, and we know that on average, they're actually drinking 1 cup per day, okay? And so now let's go back through and let's think about how we can actually do this math. So one distinction I want to make is that we have to make some assumptions here around how many people are actually drinking coffee. Because we know that there's 100,000 people living in Cambridge, but let's think about this. Usually only adults are the ones that are drinking coffee. Kids and babies don't really drink coffee. And so some percentage are going to be adults, which let's assume 80% are adults, which gets us 80K. So there's 80K adults, but let's say that only half of them are actually coffee drinkers. So times 50%, which is 40K. So apologies for this messy math, but 40K coffee drinkers. Now they drink 1 cup of coffee per day, so that's 40K cups still. But what percentage of those cups are being sold in cafes versus brewed at home? And this is where, because I have the answer, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to see that roughly 50% of cups of coffee are sold at cafes versus brewed at home. Now, even though I had the answer, in a case interview scenario, it's totally okay to make an assumption here, as long as it's baked in some kind of rationale. So you should be able to say, okay, based on my knowledge, having gone to some coffee shops and as a coffee drinker myself, it sounds reasonable to me that half of the cups of coffee that people are consuming would be sold at cafes versus brewed at home. Because if I think about from my experience, I drink maybe 10 cups of coffee a week, and half of those are from my local Starbucks, half of those I brew in my dorm room. Something like that. As long as you say it confidently and make it convincing, as long as it's not totally out of whack, then you're fine with the assumptions. And you're not being tested on the assumptions as much as you're being tested on the actual methodology and the equation that you've come up with. And so again, we have 20K cups of coffee that are being produced at cafes, and we need to still annualize this though, because remember, this is on a daily basis. And so to get to an annual number, we need to multiply this 20K by the number of days in a year. Now, in this case, let's round to 350 instead of 365, because it makes the math a little bit easier. And so 20K times 350 days per year is going to get us roughly 7 million cups in a year. And so I don't know if you can see that, but this is our market size, 7 million cups. And so the first thing you should do after you come up with this number is you need to take a step back and sanity check your numbers and think about, is this reasonable? Does this feel reasonable to me? And try to think aloud and give your interviewer your initial reaction and show them what you're thinking. And you want to say something about, okay, so it looks like we've come up to a number of 7 million cups of coffee on an annual basis as the market size for coffee sold in cafes in Cambridge, England. And it is a little bit tough, given that I don't have any reference points to compare this number to, but 7 million cups sounds reasonable to me, given what I know. Something like that. Ideally, you have another number to compare it to, but you won't always have this. And single data points are tough because they don't really mean anything in isolation unless you can look at some other number to get a sense of the size and the scale. But basically, after you do this, you're going to move to the next part of the question. And the interviewer is going to push you to this point, which is, now that you have the market size, your friend wants to gain a better understanding of how much coffee she would need to sell to break even in her first year. And so the interviewer is actually going to give us some additional information here for this break-even analysis. And so they're going to tell us that the price that we're selling coffee at is £3 per cup. The cost to run the shop is 245,610 British pounds. Or sorry, that's actually the cost to open the shop. So that's your upfront CapEx. And then there's a cost to actually run the shop each year, which is going to be £163,740. And then finally, the variable cost, so the cost per cup of coffee, is simply going to be £1 per cup. And so they just want to know, how many cups of coffee does your friend need to sell in order to break even in year one? I'm going to write year one up here. And it's always important to clarify if they don't give you the time frame under which you're supposed to be calculating this break even, because break even under what, like 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? It could mean a lot of things. And so it's important to clarify again what the time frame is. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm first going to calculate the variable profit, which we can see is simply, or the profit per cup, which is simply £2 per cup. And then we have a bunch of these fixed costs right here, right? So we have like the cost to open the shop plus the cost to run the shop. Oh, sure. Now the total, if we sum up these two fixed cost buckets right here, is going to be roughly, and I'll just put it down here, $409,350. Yeah. And so all we need to do is take this number and divide it by the variable profit per cup, which is dividing by 2, in order to get to our break even. And again, reminding you that this is the year one break even, which is why we've added these two numbers together. Because you're going to open it, and then you're going to have to run it for a year. And so in year one, you incur both of these costs. And so if we divide this by 2, what we get is 204,675. Should be British pounds, but I put a dollar sign by accident. So that's how many cups of coffee she needs to sell in year one in order to just break even. Not even to make like a significant profit. And so what you should do again is you should look at this number and you should think to yourself and think aloud to your interviewer about what this means and whether or not you think this is achievable or not. Whether or not you think it's reasonable. You should say something like, okay, so it sounds like we have to produce 204,000 cups of coffee in year one in order to just break even. Now, do I think this is reasonable? Does it sound reasonable to me? I think that given that the market for coffee cups in Cambridge, England is 7 million, then this 200,000 is just a small drop in the bucket of that 7 million. In fact, if we were to do some quick math, I mean, 200K over 7 million is less than 5% of the entire market. So I think it's quite attainable, at least given what I know. And so this is the part of the case where now the interviewer is going to push you to come to a final recommendation and move you on to the synthesis. Synthesis simply meaning taking all of the information that you've gathered today and combining it into a concise recommendation. And the process that I always like to suggest people follow is you want to start with your recommendation, you want to follow up with some risks, then you want to end with next steps. And I'll show you why in a second. And so you want to take a minute and you want to basically think through everything that you've learned today, all the analysis that you've done, all of the data and the information that you've gathered, and you want to just think about a defensible recommendation that you can come up with. And so in our scenario, what we could say to our friend is, hey, so I've taken some time to think about whether or not it makes sense for you to open up a coffee shop in Cambridge, England. And after doing some analysis, I think it makes sense for you to go ahead with opening up this coffee shop because I've done some market research and you would only need to sell about 200,000 cups of coffee in your first year, which is only about 5%, in order to break even and to make a profit. And given what I know about the market, there is, for example, no major players that are greater than 20% market share. I'm making this up, but assuming that you had learned that in the case. And so I think that it's a good idea for you to go ahead with doing this. Now that said, there are a number of risks as well, including actually being able to execute on running this coffee shop successfully. There could be some legal issues as well when we're trying to open up a new store, and there could be issues with our customers just not liking our coffee. And so as a potential next step, what I would recommend is for us to understand these risks a little bit better, we should probably do some customer research to understand what people are looking for in Cambridge, England when it comes to coffee shops, and also probably looking into the legal considerations of how do we actually open up a new business in this specific city. And so that's the case. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.